Hey everyone, this is Aaron, and you're listening to the Seinfeld Law Podcast to hear all of our outrageous, egregious, and preposterous takes on the legal issues of our beloved show, Seinfeld. And today, we are honoring Martin Luther King Jr. by asking a question that maybe he himself even pondered: which pastry is the one that best reflects the legal doctrines about race in this country? And Jerry says, look to the cookie. But as we're going to see, that might not be so clear to look to the black and white cookie. Zach, what do you have to say?
Well, we'll save that exact answer to that question for the very end. But let's get started at least with just a brief overview of the law. Basically, the 14th Amendment is passed after the Civil Rights Act. Is passed after the Civil War. And within the 14th Amendment is this little provision called the Equal Protection Clause. Equal Protection Clause is basically written to do as it says, provide equal protection to all Americans regardless of race. And then that's sort of left, as a lot of provisions in the Constitution, sort of a generic statement until the 1896 decision of Plessy v. Ferguson. Plessy v. Ferguson is now an infamous decision because it said that you could have separate laws that treat white and black Americans equally, even if they are provided with separate services. The phrase that comes out of that is separate but equal. So as long as you're provided with equal services, they can remain separate, and that would still be provisional under the Equal Protection Clause. And this carries on for a few decades, during which Jim Crow laws are passed. And what are Jim Crow laws?
Well, Jim Crow laws were laws that prohibited blacks and whites from integrating in public areas. So you'd have, public drinking fountains, but one of them was for a white person and one of them is for a black person, or public bathrooms, or any kind of other public facility. States were allowed to say this one is only for whites and this one is only for blacks, and that lasted all the way up until, it's 1954, I want to say, when Brown v. Board of Ed came down.
1954. So 58
good.
Years later. That's a pretty good memory.
Yeah, so for almost 60 years you had this, it's segregation. You had segregation of races in legally. Then Brown v. Board of Ed came down and said, no, hold up. We're going to reverse course on that, because having things that, even though they have the appearance of being equal or sort of statutorily are considered equal, in actuality separate is inherently therefore unequal. And not only that, just as a thematic point, the court also found that in reality a lot of these separate facilities were actually unequal and not being given the proper funding. But even if they were, the court said, even if they were given the same amount of funding or upkeep or things like that, they would still be considered unequal by the court's opinion. And therefore it struck down the Plessy v. Ferguson. It had a reversal on it, ironically, much like Jerry's reversal at the end of this episode, changed course and reset the history and the legal doctrine in America to say that segregation is unlawful and there cannot be separate public facilities for black and white people.
Yeah, and just a few fun facts. Thurgood Marshall was the one who argued.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Brown v. Red for the Supreme Court, and then of course, just about 10 or 15 years later, he is the first African American to be nominated and then confirmed to the Supreme Court, where he served for almost 35 years, I think, until the early 90s.
He was served until Clarence Thomas replaced him, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's right.
Yeah, so that takes care of sort of the overview of the public, the doctrine about public facilities. But what about private businesses? How did the government get around to regulating that and stopping segregation? Because I've never heard of a bar in my lifetime that said, no blacks allowed or no Jews allowed or something like that. But 50 years ago, that was allowed. So how did the government start to stop that?
Yeah, so it's not for another 10 years, actually, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There's a few Civil Rights Acts in the 19th century, and there's some Civil Rights Acts after this, but this is the one that everyone really, where we get most of the law from. And this prevents private businesses. It does something similar to what the Constitution does. It basically prevents private businesses from discriminating based on race, national origin, religion. There might be one or two others in there.
But I don't understand, because, you always hear, oh, it's my private. I can do what I want with my private business. So how can the government, like, what gives the government that power to say no, you can't discriminate against somebody because of their race, even though you're a private business? How do
Yeah.
they get around that?
Yeah, it's really hard. So they actually used the Commerce Clause, which is basically how the federal government regulates interstate commerce. So the FDA, um, some other aspects,
Other government
other
agencies
government,
that, as a lawyer, you shouldn't have any
yeah,
relative your time.
government stuff, government things, laws. So they use a Commerce Clause. Basically, they said that we can regulate private business, to enact anti discrimination laws. So you can't discriminate on race, origin, national origin, religion, under this principle. But just as we could regulate, the how much iron is in wheat, enriched wheat products, so too we can regulate, and say that you can't discriminate based on these principles that are in the law. And of course, that actually, if for those of you alive and old enough to remember the 1964 presidential race, that was a big aspect, debate between Barry Goldwater and Lyndon Johnson. Basically wasn't even about the substance of the law. I think a lot of people agreed that the Civil Rights Act itself was perfectly okay, and a lot of states had passed their own civil rights legislation. But it became more about this: where does the power of the government? Can they even do this? 60 years later, it's pretty clear that the federal government not only could, but perhaps certainly should have that power. And the law has stood for the last 60 years or so.
So just to kind of recap then, an overview, we go from there's no laws on the books about race in America. Then we get a constitutional amendment that says you cannot discriminate based upon race. About 30 years after that, we get the Plessy v. Ferguson decision that says, what does discrimination mean? It means separate but equal, so you can't give lesser treatment to somebody because of their race, but you can give separate treatment. And that created the Jim Crow laws, which allowed for different public facilities for the people of different races. Then Brown v. Board of Ed reverses course on that and says, no, we have to have integration and that people have to be able to use the same facilities. And then 10 years after that, the civil rights legislation comes around and allows the government to regulate even private businesses to make sure that there's segregation even in the private sector.
Yeah, and this pretty much, for the most part, completes the major civil rights legislation with regards to race, religion, national origin. There's a few bits of legislation that comes later and some Supreme Court cases that come later, but this kind of rounds out the major decisions.
Well, so with that intellectual and academic and historical knowledge, now we can answer the important question of which pastry best reflects this legal doctrine.
Yeah, so Jerry says it's a black and white cookie, but as
look to the cookie.
Look to the cookie. But he also reverses on the cookie, and I think that's not. I mean, who knows what Larry David and Jerry Seinfeld were thinking when they wrote this? But the black and white cookie. Remember, they're separate on the cookie. Now they might be equal, but they're separate, and so I don't think that the black and white cookie really is a good representation of this. And as Aaron said, shortly a while ago, Jerry reverses on the cookie. He does a reversal just like the Supreme Court did on that kind of separate but equal structure.
Yeah, because let's look at the black and white cookie even more, where it's, as Brown v. Board of Ed said, separate is inherently unequal. And let's face it, those two sides of the cookie are never exactly equal anyway. I mean, they might appear to be that way, but when you take a closer look, there's some of it globbing on one side. It's uneven. One side is bigger, or it's diagonal, so...
You can't get both in one bite. I mean, I know as much as Jerry tries, it's almost impossible after the first or second bite.
Yeah, so the black and white cookie, I mean, it has the look of being the racial cohesion, but it is not reflective of our legal doctrine at all. It's stuck in the 19th century with that Plessy v. Ferguson decision.
Yeah, so what would be the best pastry?
Well, you got to think about something that's going to have both chocolate and vanilla. And...
Yeah, Black Forest cake, maybe? Carrot cake?
Well, carrot cake, I mean, there's no chocolate in carrot cake.
Unfortunately not. But Black Forest, I think that's the same problem you have with the black and white cookie. Separate layers. We don't want layers.
We don't want layers. What we want is, well, I guess what we want is that old mainstay, the chocolate babka, where everything's swirling together in one cohesive pastry. You can't eat a babka without having both the chocolate and I mean it's not really vanilla, but the I guess the pastry portion of it which has the appearance of being lighter skinned or lighter colored. Um, you can't eat a babka without getting both in one bite, and they're not separate. They're layered, but they're wrapped all together in one.
They're swirled into each other. I mean, they're hugging, they're hanging out together. There's no layers. There's no separation. The chocolate babka. That's when you think of civil rights legislation, you think of chocolate babka. There's no other way to say it.
Yeah, I can't think of any other pastry that I would want to have to celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. than the chocolate babka. Although now when you said swirling chocolate, it made me think of that other episode where George talks about the swirling chocolate. I can't remember which one it was now when he's talking about it.
That, I believe, is an evidence discussion, which we will have to save for another day. But make sure you check out our website, SeinfeldLaw.com. You can find us on Facebook, on our page Seinfeld Law. You can find us on Twitter, @Seinfeld Law. You can email us, SeinfeldLaw@gmail.com. And, we just want to wish everyone a really happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day. To remember to live every day through his teachings and what he taught this great country. He made the world a better place for it. He made all of us better and his country better for it and for what he taught us. And, we can only hope that he had spent, the last, an additional 60 years of his life spreading his good word and spreading his teachings. And with that, wish you all a happy rest of your holiday weekend. And until you see us next time. Happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day.